Hello, everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I am a Tolkien scholar. And that means that I'm the type of guy that you can come to with all of your questions about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, or any of his other stories or works or poems or translations, or just anything about Tolkien in general. I'm the guy that you can come to with questions. And if you have a question for me, you can feel free to ask right in the comments section. I don't mind that. As a matter of fact, I enjoy reading the comment section and answering the comments there. But if you want to be featured in a video, or if you feel it's just too much for comment, you can find me on Quora. There is a link to that in the description. You follow that link and you go to Quora. It's very easy to make an account there. You can sign up with Facebook, or you could sign up with Google, or you could just make an account through there. It's a very quick process, and you can ask me a question on there. Or if you just have a Quora account and you're on there, and anytime you ask a question about anything Tolkien related, there's going to be, right after you write the question, there's going to be a part where it's going to suggest people for you to tag to ask the question of specific people, and my name is going to be at or near the top of the list, so you can find me that way. Anyway, guys, we have let's see what I have. 15 questions? Yes, 15 questions. I had to bring it up there. 15 questions to get through today. And of course, we're going to start with a reading, which I have chosen The Return of the King. I wanted to read something from The Scouring of the Shire because I feel that it's a bit of an overlooked chapter. I feel that a lot of people who maybe came up reading this, in my time at least, sort of are like, okay, we've done the important part, the ring is destroyed, and now all this other stuff has to happen. And I think as a young man, really as a boy, I didn't understand the importance of it. As I read through The Lord of the Rings over and over again throughout the years, I came to appreciate it more and more. And now I think it might actually be the most important part of the book. And then, of course, it didn't wind up in the movie, The Return of the King, the live-action version, which is sort of understandable because the movie was already very, very long, and this would have lengthened it a bit. It really should have had a part 1 and a part 2. But that being said, The Scouring of the Shire is really interesting, and a lot of people really, I want to get to this before I get to the reading. I want to say, a lot of people misunderstand the meaning of the word scour, and they think it's something bad, because it is a chapter about bad things coming to the Shire. But scouring means cleaning. It means removing what is bad. So it's not in a reference to what Saruman does to the Shire. It's in reference to what Frodo and Merry and Pippin and Sam and do to the Shire, and all the rest of the hobbits that join their cause. The part that I'm going to specifically read is when they get to Bag End, where Saruman has made his home. Well, they don't know Saruman's there. I think they suspect because Gandalf told them that Saruman was up to something previous to leaving their company right after Bree. "Where is that miserable Lotho hiding?" said Merry. "They had searched every room and found no living thing save rats and mice. Shall we turn on the others to search the sheds?" "This is worse than Mordor," said Sam. "Much worse in a way. It comes home to you, as they say, because it is home, and you remember it before it was all ruined." "Yes, this is Mordor," said Frodo. "Just one of its works. Saruman was doing its work all the time, even when he thought he was working for himself. And the same with those that Saruman tricked, like Lotho." Merry looked round in dismay and disgust. "Let's get out," he said. "If I had known all this mischief he had caused, I should have stuffed my pouch down Saruman's throat. No doubt, but you did not. And so I am able to welcome you home." There, standing at the door, was Saruman himself, looking well-fed and well-pleased. His eyes gleamed with malice and amusement. A sudden light broke on Frodo. "Sharky!" he cried. Saruman laughed. "So you've heard the name, have you? All my people used to call me that in Isengard, I believe. A sign of affection, possibly. But evidently you did not expect to see me here." "I did not," said Frodo. "But I might have guessed. A little mischief in a mean way. Gandalf warned me that you were still capable of it." "Quite capable," said Saruman. "And more than a little. You made me laugh, you little hobbit lordlings, riding along with all those great people, so secure and pleased with your little selves. You thought you had done very well out of it all, and could now just amble back and have a nice quiet time in the country. Saruman's home could be all wrecked, and he could be turned out, but no one could touch yours. Oh, no, Gandalf would look after your affairs." Saruman laughed again. "Not he. When his tools have done their task, he drops them. But you must go dangling after him, dawdling and talking and riding him round twice as far as you needed. Well, thought I, if they're such fools, I will get ahead of them, and teach them a lesson. One ill turn deserves another. It would have been a sharper lesson if only you had given me a little more time and more men. Still, I have already done much that you will find it hard to mend or undo in your lives, and it will be pleasant to think of that and set it against my injuries. Well, if that is what you find pleasure in, said Frodo, I pity you. It will be a pleasure of memory only, I fear. Go at once and never return. The hobbits of the village had seen Saruman come out of one of the huts, and at once they came crowding up to the door of Bag End. When they heard Frodo's command, they murmured angrily, Don't let him go! Kill him! He's a villain and a murderer! Kill him! Saruman looked round at their hostile faces and smiled. Kill him, he mocked. Kill him if you think there are enough of you, my brave hobbits. He drew himself up and stared at them darkly with black eyes. But do not think that when I lost all my goods I lost all my power. Whoever strikes me shall be accursed, and if my blood stains the Shire it shall wither, and never again be healed. The hobbits recoiled, but Frodo said, Do not believe him. He has lost all power save his voice that can still daunt you and deceive you if you let it. But I will not have him slain. It is useless to meet revenge with revenge. It will heal nothing. Go, Saruman, by the speediest way. Worm, Worm, Saruman called, and out of a nearby hut came Wormtongue, crawling almost like a dog. To the road again, Worm, said Saruman. These fine fellows and lordlings are turning us adrift again. Come along. Saruman turned to go, and Wormtongue shuffled after him. But even as Saruman passed close to Frodo, a knife flashed in his hand, and he stabbed swiftly. The blade turned on the hidden mailcoat and snapped. A dozen hobbits, led by Sam, leaped forward with a cry and flung the villain to the ground. Sam drew his sword. No, Sam, said Frodo, do not kill him even now, for he has not hurt me, and in any case I do not wish him to be slain in this evil mood. He was great once, of a noble kind, that we should dare not to raise our hands against. He is fallen, and his curse is beyond us. His cure is beyond us. But I would still spare him in the hopes that he may find it. Saruman rose to his feet and stared at Frodo. There was a strange look in his eyes of mingled wonder and respect and hatred. You have grown, halfling, he said. Yes, you have grown very much. You are wise and cruel. You have robbed my revenge of sweetness, and now I must go hence in bitterness, in debt to your mercy. I hate it, and you. Well, I go, and I will trouble you no more. But do not expect me to wish you health and long life. You will have neither. But that is not my doing. I merely foretell. He walked away, and the hobbits made a lane for him to pass, but their knuckles whitened as they gripped on their weapons. Wormtongue hesitated, then followed his master. Wormtongue, called Frodo. You need not follow him. I know of no evil you have done to me. You can have rest and food here for a while until you are stronger and can go your own ways. Wormtongue halted and looked back at him, half prepared to stay. Saruman turned. No evil, he cackled. Oh no, even when he sneaks out at night it is only to look at the stars. But did I hear someone ask where poor Lotho was hiding? You know, don't you? Will you tell them? Wormtongue cowered down and whimpered. No. Then I will, said Saruman. Worm killed your chief, poor little fellow. Your nice little boss, didn't you, Worm? Stabbed him in his sleep, I believe. Buried him, I hope, though Worm has been hungry lately. No, Worm is not really nice. You had better leave him to me. A look of wild hatred came into Wormtongue's red eyes. You told me to. You made me do it, he hissed. Saruman laughed. You do it, Sharky says. Always, don't you, Worm? Well, now he says follow. He kicked Wormtongue in his face as he groveled and turned and made off. But at that something snapped. Suddenly Wormtongue rose up, drawing a hidden knife, and then with a snarl like a dog he sprang on Saruman's back, jerked his head back, cut his throat, and with a yell ran off down the lane. Before Frodo could recover or speak a word, 3 hobbit bows twanged, and Wormtongue fell dead. To the dismay of those that stood by, about the body of Saruman a grey mist gathered, and rising slowly to a great height like smoke from a fire, as a pale, shrouded figure, he loomed over the hill. For a moment it wavered, looking to the west, but out of the west came a cold wind and bent away, and with a sigh dissolved into nothing. Frodo looked down at the body with a pity and horror, for as he looked, it seemed that long years of death were suddenly revealed in it, and it shrank, and the shriveled face became rags of skin upon a hideous skull. Lifting up the skirt of the dirty cloak that sprawled beside it, he covered it over and turned away. That's the end of that, said Sam. A nasty end, and I wish I needn't have seen it. but it's good riddance. And it was the very last of the war, I hope, said Merry. I hope so, said Frodo, and sighed. The very last stroke. But to think that it should fall here, at the very door of Bag End, among all my hopes and fears. At least I never expected that. I shan't call it the end till we've cleared up this mess, said Sam gloomily, and that'll take a lot of time and work. So yeah, that's the end of Saruman, at least as an incarnate in Middle-earth. And, you know, there's a few interesting things to point out. The word Sharky, there's a footnote here. It was probably Orcish in origin, Sharku, which means old man. The thought of Wormtongue eating Lotho Sackville Baggins is an interesting one, because I get the question occasionally, did he actually do that, or was Saruman lying? And it's my belief that Saruman was absolutely lying. I think that if he had eaten Lotho, and I don't see why he would, because all of the food in the Shire is already being routed to Lotho, and you know, Saruman and Wormtongue would have taken that over, and it's possible to think that Saruman was just not allowing him to eat, but I don't see how, you know, I mean, if he was sneaking around, he would have snuck out and gotten himself some food rather easily. You know, the Shire is not exactly a barren place. And he has really no motivation to cannibalize Lotho in that sense. He definitely killed him on Saruman's orders, as stated. But I believe that, you know, Saruman is thinking in this very sort of bizarre and very twisted sense that these hobbits have taken everything from me. He doesn't take responsibility for any of his actions or the consequences of his actions. For example, he says that he's being turned out again, that they're being set adrift again. But he was never turned out of Orthanc. He basically escaped it. He was told that he could stay there, and that, as a matter of fact, since he had refused to join Gandalf, that he would have to stay there, and it was Treebeard let him out after he sort of tricked Treebeard into doing that. But, you know, he's saying it as, oh, you ruined my home, you know, you turned me out. He doesn't talk about all the terrible things that he did that led to that. It's all what you did to me. And from his sort of twisted perspective, now Frodo, with his mercy, which he hates, as he stated, he hates his mercy, is going to rob him of his final servant, his only loyal man at this point. And he will say anything to sort of poison the well so that Frodo would not allow Wormtongue to stay in the Shire. Because even, you know, he had said that, well, he killed Lotho. And Wormtongue replies, well, that was on your orders. And I think Frodo would have still let him stay at that point. But then if he said he ate him, now, you know, that's a very, you know, it's disgusting. It's sort of like it gives this sense of revulsion to imagine such a thing. So, and even, you know, then he's saying you are merciful and you are cruel. Or you are wise and you are cruel, and I hate your mercy. So what's interesting about it, you know, and of course then we have Saruman's death. He rises up from his body, his spirit, his actual spirit, looks to the west and is scattered by a cold wind. That's Manwë saying, no, you're not allowed back. And this, to me, the fact that he looked to the west with a capital W, tells me that even after everything he did, the burning of the Westfold, the attacks on Rohan, the sacking of the Shire, all these terrible, terrible things that he did, he still expected to be welcomed back into Valinor. He still saw himself as one of the good ones, you know. And it's amazing to think that Saruman could think that way, but he does think that way, and we see it here. The only other thing that I wanted to comment on in this particular section... Let's see, what was it? I mentioned the Sharku thing. Oh, yes, Wormtongue. So, Wormtongue gets shot by the hobbits, and it's interesting to think, well, why did they do that? He was escaping, he was running off, but that's what Frodo wanted to happen. And what's interesting is that Frodo is sort of like, we shouldn't kill him because he's of this very, you know, even fallen as he is of this very noble sort of, this kind, you know, the wizards. And it's not really for us to execute him. And then he is essentially executed, in a sense. He's murdered by Wormtongue. And whether you would call that just or not is interesting, but the hobbits sort of, it's interesting, because they obviously they wanted to kill Saruman, and then they kill the person who killed Saruman. And it does bring up some questions. Were they doing that because they needed their pound of flesh? Was it just a reaction and they just weren't thinking? In the movie version, it was Legolas that shot Wormtongue. And, somebody said to me recently that, from a certain perspective, we can see in the film version that Legolas could have been trying to save Saruman. Because instead of one quick cut where he cut his throat, he was stabbing him in the back repeatedly, so Legolas might have just reacted to try to save him. So there's a lot of reasons. It doesn't mention which hobbits shot him. There were 3 hobbits that shot him, but we don't know who they were or what their reasoning was, or even if they had the same reasoning. One of them could have just been reacting. One of them could be very angry. One of them could have thought that he had been denied the sort of a pound of flesh situation here. It's a very interesting ethical dilemma here in this scene, which I find fascinating to talk about. But anyway, we're going to get to your questions. So let's start with the first one. Our first question comes in by the request of Robert Steckling, who asks, why do events in Tolkien's world take so long to happen? In the nature of Middle-earth, 11,000 years passes before the elves are even discovered. In the Second Age, Sauron takes nearly a century to attack the elves after the ring is forged. Why? So I would say that the reason why is because the principal characters, not so much in The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, but in the Silmarillion and its satellite stories, which of course include the nature of Middle-earth, all of the principal characters, well, or at least a great many of them, are immortal or undying or eternal. Sauron, for example, he's eternal. He's an angel. He was there for the creation of the universe. 100 years is like nothing to him. It's like a season. It's like a month, maybe. Another example used was the discovery of the elves, and in this case, the Valar did not know where the elves would awaken, and they did not know when the elves would awaken, and they weren't living in Middle-earth, so they weren't exactly covering a lot of ground. Orome would come to Middle-earth and look around. That's why he found them. They would come in like ones and twos. They would come to Middle-earth at this point, but they weren't currently... I mean, well, they were living there. They were living there. This was after the First War, but it was before the War of the Valar, which is sort of the second part of the same war, because that was the war for the sake of the elves. The Valar, but they didn't know when the elves were going to awaken, and they certainly didn't know where. And like I said, time to them, being in the world was sort of their first experience with time. They had music in the Timeless Halls. They had, and music suggests a song that has a beginning, a middle, and end, so that suggests some sort of passage of time, but not in the same way, where things would change and such. So in the Silmarillion, by the time Orome finds the elves, there are a lot of them, and they have a functioning society and language. In the book The Nature of Middle-earth, it tells us how they got to that point. Because Tolkien decided that the awakening of the elves, that there was only going to be 144 of them, there had to be a good deal of time between their awakening and the discovery of a society where they had generations, and they had families, and they had language, and they had culture. So that actually makes sense. It's they just weren't discovered because nobody really knew where to look or even when to look. Okay, next question. Okay, this question came in by the request of somebody whose username is just MMM, 3 M's. What translation of the Bible did Tolkien use? That's a good question. It's not the sort of question I get very often. Tolkien was an accomplished Bible scholar, And he was working actually on a full translation of the Jerusalem Bible, though he did stop working on it to write The Lord of the Rings. And some of his work still wound up in it, and he was credited as a chief contributor, which he called very generous because he did not actually finish much more than the Book of Jonah. However, the personal Bible that Tolkien had in his home and that he used would be the New Testament in the Westminster version of the Sacred Scriptures. So, and you can actually, if you ever go to the Tolkien Museum, you can see his personal Bible there, and it has his notes and even corrections to the translation written in the margins, and you could see that there are burns and ash from his tobacco, his pipe. So it was very much what he used. So that was definitely his personal Bible. Okay, next question. Here's one that came in from somebody named Ido, who asks, if Sauron was a Maya spirit, not bid to clothe himself in flesh like the Astari, and could use his full raw power in Middle-earth, why did he bother creating the ring and putting a lot of his power into it? Why not just retain that power and dominate? Because that's what Morgoth did. And Morgoth lost. The One Ring was designed to control others from afar without expending power in doing so. He spent his power into an implement that he could wear on his person and not easily be separated from. Morgoth was the one who said, I'm just going to use my full power and dominate. But it made him weaker. It didn't serve him well. It spent his power. The way that Hurin said it in the book The Children of Hurin, that he has spent his power on himself. He poured his power into his armies, into the world itself, and he wound up weakening over time until Eanwa gave him the thrashing that ended the War of Wrath. So, Sauron, who did not actually participate in the War of Wrath, he's looking at all this. And then later on, he's probably reflecting on, how could he do differently? And he didn't even want to be a more effective Morgoth. He wanted to be different from Morgoth. He saw himself as the one bringing order, whereas Morgoth was just evil for evil's sake. So he saw beauty and order to him meant domination, to control people that he sees as being chaotic, like the elves, for example. And that's what the rings were for. They were for the elves, and the One Ring was going to control the elves. He wanted to control them from afar and make them do his bidding. Whereas Morgoth just wanted to hurt them. So the thing about it is that when you try to dominate the elves fight back. They're very powerful and they're very wise. And you can't just go to war with them and expect to win consistently. I mean, even Morgoth, he had some great victories, but in the end, he lost. So what it really comes down to is Sauron is not as powerful as Morgoth. And he knows that if he tries to do what Morgoth did, it's going to go even worse for him. So he had to come up with a different way to go about things. Okay, next question. Here is the question from the thumbnail. I like when it comes up earlier on in the video. I don't like making you guys wait all the way through. This came in from Jeremy Chung, who asks, why did Sméagol end up becoming Gollum? Why weren't the other ring bearers turned into a hideous version of themselves? So Gollum stands alone from the others in the way he took the ring and the way that he used the ring. Sméagol took the ring by force. He murdered someone to get it, and then he used it for evil and mischief. Evil with a small e. Stealing, that sort of thing. You know, not dominating the world or anything like that. Isildur took it off a body. Déagol found it. Bilbo found it. Frodo inherited it. Sam took it off what he thought was a dead body, and so on. So the One Ring, though, is interesting. It was only made for Sauron. It was not meant for anybody else to ever wear it. Least of all, mortals like these. Gollum had the ring for hundreds of years. Bilbo had it for 60 years. Frodo had it for 18 years. Isildur had it for 2 years. Sam had it for about a day. Gollum it became something that reflected himself, and it happened over a long period of time. It wasn't all at once. He had a lot of time all to himself with the ring, with Sauron's power. And the interesting thing about it is that Gollum's relationship with the ring, his relationship with Sauron's power, he doesn't even understand that it is power. He understands that it makes him invisible. He doesn't understand how it could be used to dominate others, and I don't think he has any designs on doing that. Even if he came to understand what the ring is, he would not be strong enough to use it, and he would not have the inclination to use it. He thought small. He wasn't a big thinker like Sauron was. The ring needs somebody who is a big thinker. And that's definitely, it's not Gollum, it's certainly not Sam, it's not even Frodo, really. Isildur was a big thinker, but he was too good for the ring. So the ring wasn't really for him either. Not that it's for anybody but Sauron. But what it comes down to is that he had it for a really long time, Gollum, and he was already a nasty person. Not at all like Isildur or like Bilbo or like Frodo or like Sam. Deagle had it for like, all of a few minutes. He was not a great person either, but he didn't get to have it for very long. So the difference is obviously length of time, the type of person he is, the way that he took it, and Gandalf says that does matter, the way that he came into the ring, and of course what he used the ring for, evil and mischief. But small evil, small mischief. He has an interesting relationship with the ring. He doesn't want to use it, he only wishes to possess it. And that's something that Sauron doesn't understand. To have that power in your hand and to only want to hold it and look at it and adore it, even while hating it. In The Hobbit, it's mentioned that he used to wear it all the time, and then after a while, he found that he could not do that anymore. He didn't want to wear it all the time, but he wanted to keep it close to him, so he kept it in a pocket. But then after a while, it galled him, so he kept it hidden on his little island there, and that's, of course, part of what led to the eventuality of him losing the ring and it passing to another. Okay, next question. So here's a question that came in from Matthew Culbertson, who asks, why didn't the hobbits have rings crafted for them when the elves and dwarves had their own? So here's the thing, nobody crafted rings for dwarves, nobody crafted rings for men, and certainly nobody crafted rings for hobbits. Most people at the time in the Second Age when the rings were made, they didn't even know that hobbits existed yet. So I want you to say it with me. Here it is. All of the 19 rings were made by elves and for elves. Now say it again. All of the 19 rings were made by elves for elves. One last time. All of the 19 rings were made by elves and for elves. Not a single ring was made for men or for dwarves. The rings were made by the elves of Eregion under the tutelage of Annatar, who was actually Sauron in disguise, and they were intended for their own use. Once Annatar skipped town, and he went back to Mordor, and he crafted his own ring. The ruling ring, the ring of power, the one ring, the elves realized that they had been deceived. And they took their rings off, and they refused to allow Sauron to control them. Sauron came in with a vengeance. It took him 100 years, but that's, as we mentioned earlier, a much shorter amount of time to him than it would be to you or me. And he took 16 of the rings back. The 3 that were made after he left had already been well hidden. There was one in Lothlorien, and 2 of them were in Lindon. Sauron then handed out the stolen rings to the dwarves and to the men. He found very little success with the dwarves, but he had great success with men. So you may shift the question at this point, or I should say I may shift the question at this point and ask, well, why didn't he try it with hobbits? The answer is simple. Sauron had no idea what a hobbit was until he met Gollum. Hobbits didn't appear in Middle-earth's histories until the Third Age. Now, Merry noted in The Two Towers that they had been around longer than that, but the fact was nobody knew about them. They weren't in the histories because nobody else had met them. Besides, the very purpose of the rings was for Sauron to control leaders from a distance. important elves, dwarf lords, kings of men. He didn't gain a lot, or he wouldn't, I should say, gain a lot by controlling hobbits. Hobbits don't have grand ambitions. They don't have great power. They're not that interesting to him. At least they weren't in the Second Age. Okay, next question. Here's a question that came in from Michael Brett, who asks, would Sauron have been smarter to have Gollum killed instead of releasing him after his torture? So this is one of those things that is sort of like, well, you have the gift of hindsight. Hindsight is 20/20. But Sauron, of course, he didn't see it that way at the time. It's easy to say that it would have been better for Sauron to simply kill Gollum, though his method of killing prisoners was usually feeding them to Shelob, and Gollum had already befriended Shelob, so perhaps that would not have helped much. He is not known to execute people personally. Now, there's some Tolkien scholars that go by the names Hammond and Scull, and they wrote some books, and in one of the books they made a claim that Sauron personally executed Shagrat. But I find this source to be dubious because it has no origins in Tolkien's work. It's just surmise. Sauron noted and feared something indomitable within Gollum. He could not be dominated through fear, he could not be dominated through force, and he could not be dominated through pain. He could only be destroyed. This bothered Sauron because he was all about dominating everything in pursuit of his twisted ideal of order. He was also creeped out by the fact that Gollum had wholly consumed himself. He had been, I should say, wholly consumed with the One Ring, but with, as I mentioned earlier, no desire to master it or to use it for its intended purpose, which is the domination of others. Sauron could not fathom that a being could wish to possess his power but not make use of it. He realized then, with some relief, that his previous fears about his enemies destroying the ring were false, at least he thought, as it was so seductive that no one could wish it harm, or if they did wish it harm, they could not follow through. Of course, this is true, though Gollum's hatred of Sauron was greater, and his will to possess the ring overcame him, leading to both of their destructions. So Tolkien once noted that if there was a being in Middle-earth that had the will to destroy the ring of his own volition, it would have been Gollum, out of pure spite. What Sauron saw here was a being that would stop at absolutely nothing to obtain the One Ring, so cutting Gollum loose might give him insight into its location. He of course, would later come to regret that. And what's funny is that after he cut Gollum loose, Gollum didn't make a beeline for the ring. He went to Moria, and he stayed there until, Frodo passed right by him, basically, and then he started following Frodo around. Okay, next question. Did J.R.R. Tolkien have a book about Middle-earth before writing The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings? If not, what inspired him to write these books? So he had stories about Middle-earth before then. They weren't published until far later, after he died, as a matter of fact. But Tolkien had been writing about Middle-earth long before The Hobbit. The Hobbit, originally, upon its initial creation, didn't even take place in Middle-earth. The Hobbit was initially unconnected to Middle-earth, and upon reading it, you may be surprised to find that the terms such as Middle-earth and the Shire never appear in it. He did use names of characters from his other stories, most notably Elrond, who also mentioned Gondolin. And this was meant to be sort of a cheeky reference. He also makes reference to the Vanyar, Noldor, and Teleri. He calls them the Light Elves, the Deep Elves, and the Sea Elves. These are all for his own amusement, more than anything. The Fall of Gondolin, Beren and Luthien, and the Children of Húrin are some of his oldest stories, dating back to time that he had spent in the hospital after he had contracted trench fever during the Great War. He wrote these stories, and he later started to compile them into a connected legend that he called Quenta Silmarillion. The decision to make The Hobbit part of this connected legend came later, upon the inception of the sequel, The Lord of the Rings. Okay, next question. Here's an interesting question that came in from Helga F. Rydell, who asks, how did Sauron distribute the 7 rings to the dwarves? Wasn't his cover blown after the destruction of Eregion? I could say that, perhaps his cover would have been blown if Eregion actually had any survivors. But let's say, though, for the sake of argument, for the sake of discussion, that there were survivors and the word spread that Anatar was actually Sauron. This does not prevent Sauron from offering rings to dwarves openly as himself, or disguising himself as a different sort of creature. I would say that the former scenario makes more sense to me. At some point during The Lord of the Rings, an emissary from Mordor came to Erebor and offered up 3 rings of power to Dain the Second Ironfoot in exchange for the location of one Mr. Baggins. They may not hide the fact here that the rings were from Sauron. They even used the name Sauron openly. The fact is, the dwarves, historically, had been much more amenable to accepting things from Sauron or from Morgoth before him than the elves were. They took the rings. They weren't friends with Sauron. They didn't like Sauron, but they took them from him. Whether it was something where he was deceiving them, or whether he just said, here's some great rings, you'll love them. And the dwarves were they were too strong for him. He could not manage to control them. And I think that it's not so much a strength that does come that does come into it, I think. But I think that part of it is just they're so different from elves. Men are like elves in the sense that we're sort of the same creature. We're just not immortal like they are. But dwarves were fashioned differently. They come from a completely different stock, so to speak. So I think that the sort of magic that was used to control elves, it was never going to be able to control dwarves. It did affect them in rather negative ways, but they were still in control. Okay, next question. If you had met Gandalf in Middle-earth during The Lord of the Rings, would you have suspected him of being an Istari? Okay, so I picked this question to feature here because it's interesting linguistically. Istari is actually plural. He would not be an Istari. He would be an Istar. Istari is wizards, is what it means. Istar is wizard. Istari is wizards. So, and this comes from the Quenya verb ista, which means to know. So technically anyone who is wise is an Istar. I guess the question really means would I suspect him of being an Ainu, which is an angel. It means Holy One. And more specifically, the type of angel known as a Maya, which literally means beautiful, but it refers to the lesser angels. So if it was me, though, this is what makes the question interesting. If it was me, I've read the books, I know the story, I have all this knowledge, of course I'd know who he was. But if I'm in Middle-earth as just like a generic character, if I'm just like some hobbit who goes to the market, or you know what I mean, I'm probably not going to know that unless I just happen to be palling around with somebody who would be very wise, like Círdan, for example, and would be willing to tell me such a thing. Or maybe in, after The Lord of the Rings in the Fourth Age, and the question did say during The Lord of the Rings, but if it was afterwards, maybe I would have read Bilbo's translations of the Elvish lore, and then I would have put 2 and 2 together, and wait a minute, that Gandalf fellow, the elves called him Mithrandir, and here it says that Mithrandir was a Loren, and that he was a Maya. So that I would figure it out that way, probably, if I was the type of person who wanted to read Bilbo's translation. So it's interesting, if you just ran into him along the way, I guess what the question is really asking is how many people in Middle-earth really knew about the angels in the late Third Age. Very few people knew that. Faramir knew about it. But he was Gandalf's pupil. Bilbo knew about it because he read all the Elvish lore in it and translated it. And then, of course, there were those who were there, your Galadriels and your Elrons to a certain extent, and Círdan, of course. So, interesting. Let's move on to the next question. Why didn't the Valar immediately chase down and capture Morgoth again once he destroyed the trees and fled to Middle-earth? So this question actually came in by the request of somebody named Ben, but I would think that the name on this might have been Feanor, because that's what he was wondering. Why not take immediate action? Because doing so would have destroyed a good chunk of Middle-earth, is what it really comes down to. Tolkis and Orome immediately went after Melkor when they found out what happened, but they would not go to Middle-earth. Once he escaped to Middle-earth, they put off their pursuit, and they went back to the Ring of Doom and conferred with the rest of the Valar, and they were sitting there, seemingly idle because they can communicate telepathically, doing nothing to a casual observer. But they were making their plans. Feanor made an assumption that they were idle and they were going to remain idle, and we talked about like the passage of time and such. Feanor, being an immortal elf, time is different from like you or me, but he was still like a fairly young guy at this point. He doesn't understand eternity, and he doesn't understand why don't you act now? Why are you just sitting there? So, if the elves had never left in their rebellion, things would have went very, very differently, of course. But the question is really, why did the Valar not act immediately? Why didn't they act at all? And like I said, if they went to Middle-earth, it would have been bad. It would have been bad for Middle-earth. It was once a lot like the Undying Lands. But aside from the taint of Melkor, it was also marred by the wars between the Valar and Melkor, Morgoth. Every time the Valar used their power in Middle-earth, it made it worse. Even sending Eanwa later on with a host of elves, that was too much for the land, and the war destroyed Beleriand. It's completely gone. It's under the waves. So, yeah, the sort of power that the Valar could throw around was a lot, and the sort of power that Melkor could throw on, because he wasn't just going to let himself be captured. He had armies, he had orcs, he had trolls, he had dragons, he had vampires, he had werewolves, he had Sauron, he had the Balrog. So it wasn't just going to be an easy thing that was going to be mopped up quickly. Even the War of Wrath took 40 years. Okay, next question. Here's one that comes in by the request of Christian Conkler, who asks, why do elves in Valinor and the rest of the Undying Lands bother having royalty and royal families when the lands belong to the Ainur and the elves are only there because they were originally invited? Because they want to. That's really all there is to it. They want to have kings. And so the elves already had kings, they had royalty, they had leaders before they were invited to join the Ainur in the Undying Lands. If the Valar told them, you're going to have to give up your culture, they probably would have said, you know what, no thanks, we'll stay in Middle-earth. The belief that the Valar rule them and their sort of stock as serfs is an idea that Melkor put into their heads, or specifically put into Feanor's head, and then Feanor put into everybody else's head. It's the reason that Galadriel left, to seek out her own land to rule. The fact is, though, that each subculture of elves has their kings, and sometimes multiple kings, and that Ingva is at the top of the heap. He's king of all elves, but the Valar still own the land, Middle-earth included. Manwë is the king of Arda. He's the king of the whole world. Nowhere is out of his dominion, but there are greater kings and there are lesser kings, just as the Noldor have a king in Middle-earth and another king in Aemon, but Ingva is still above them as their king of kings, and then Manwë is above them all, and then Iluvatar is above him as well. So there are hierarchies there, of course, but like I said, really what it comes down to is that was their culture, and the Valar certainly, they invited them there so that they could live in a place without evil. It didn't work out too well, but that was the reasoning. They weren't saying, well, you have to give up your culture and follow only us, and you can't have your own kings and leaders anymore. That would have been a really, really bad thing to do, I think. Okay, next question. Here's a question from Jonah Falcon, who asks, who has more of an impact in The Lord of the Rings? Boromir, who desired the ring and forced Frodo to go alone with Sam, or Faramir, who admitted he was tempted but refused the ring and aided them? I would say Boromir had more of an impact. Faramir was obviously the greater of the two, and his impact, the biggest thing that he did, of course, was acknowledge Aragorn as king. But what it comes down to when you ask who has the most impact on the story as a whole, what you have to do is stop and think, well, what if we erase this character? What happens? How badly is it changed? So if you take Faramir out of the story, the biggest change is that Aragorn probably doesn't become king. Without Faramir, it is unlikely that Denethor would have died in that fashion, and he would not recognize Aragorn as king. I think likely that Imrahil would still follow Aragorn to the Black Gate, and a great many men of Gondor would defy their steward and go with Aragorn. Imrahil and Gandalf as well, thus distracting Sauron from what was happening in his borders. That all could have still happened. Frodo and Sam did get a restock of supplies from Faramir, but Gollum may have felt differently about Frodo. Tolkien once stated that without Faramir, Gollum may have destroyed the ring himself to spite Sauron. But if you remove Boromir and his actions, this means that Aragorn winds up going to Mordor with Frodo and Sam and Gimli. Rohan doesn't get rescued. They don't send aid to Gondor. The entire thing falls apart. Boromir was just like kind of the linchpin of the story. If you take him out, it all falls apart. But I've always said it's sort of like that Star Trek episode, Tapestry. The story is like a tapestry. If you start plucking at a thread that you don't like, the whole thing falls apart. Okay, next question. Here's another question from Ido, who asks, do you think it would have been strange for Frodo, Bilbo, Legolas, Gimli, and Sam to have encountered Olorin in Valinor, having only known the spirit clothed in flesh as Gandalf? Well, what I think is strange is to think of them meeting, or at least with Bilbo and Frodo, meeting Olorin, because they sailed to the west with him. The thing is, sailing to the west from the Grey Havens at Lindon is the end of the story for Frodo and for Bilbo. They exit Middle-earth to go beyond to the Undying Lands. The rest of their lives is a mystery. And the same can be said for Gandalf and Elrond and Galadriel. We can make some safe surmises to what happens to a few of these characters when they arrive. Galadriel would be, for example, reunited with her father Finarfin. Elrond would be reunited with his wife Celebrian. Beyond this, we really don't know anything. Yes, people who say Frodo lived in Eressëa, they're wrong. Not because we know that he did not, but because we don't know that he did. Beyond the typical reunions, all other surmise I find to be weak. This includes whether or not Gandalf could cast aside his guise and discarnate within the life of his mortal friends, or if he stayed as Gandalf until they passed. The other characters exit the story in the same way Gimli and Legolas were said to take a boat from the southern havens seeking the west. Do we know if they arrive or not? We really don't. Sam leaves the Shire at a very old age to seek the Grey Havens. We're not even told that he gets on a boat, just that he goes off to seek the Havens. We don't know more than that. All of these characters will die, except for Legolas, and he's the one that would understand Gandalf's true form the easiest. So if you are of the mind that he would stay as Gandalf during his mortal friend's lifetime, only Legolas would see him in his true form. Or perhaps they all would, but considering that they knew that he died and returned, changing form would not be the strangest thing that he's done. Okay, next question. So Jamal Williams here asks me a doozy of a question. How did Numenor fall? That's a long story, and it's best understood by reading the story in the Silmarillion called Akallabeth, also known as the Fall of Numenor. But if I give you the Cliff Notes version, the long and short of it, Numenor lost their faith. They were once in great friendship with the elves, but they became envious of the undying nature of the elves while they had to die. They didn't understand that death was a blessing, and they wished to abide in the undying lands because they believed that would make them immortal. They were told that it doesn't work that way, but they turned away from the elves, and they turned away from the Valar. There was civil unrest, and there was a splinter group known as the King's Men who rose to prominence, and they colonized and enslaved parts of Middle-earth. The King's Men eventually sided with Sauron, and they became known as the Black Númenóreans. The last king of Númenor was a man named Pharazôn, and he took the throne by force from his cousin Tarmiriel by forcing her into a marriage. He was one of the most unfaithful out there, but he was not a Black Númenórean. He was opposed to Sauron, at least at first. He captured Sauron after a siege at Mordor and brought him to Númenor as a prisoner. Sauron seduced the king and became his advisor. He erected a temple of worship to Melkor, and the island fell into devil worship and human sacrifice. Sauron convinced Pharazôn that he could gain the immortality that he sought by conquering the Undying Lands. So Pharazôn led a fleet to Aemon, and the answer from the Valar was to call God himself, Iluvatar, to intervene. And as he is Iluvatar, was rather heavy-handed in his response. He changed the nature of the world. He removed the Undying Lands from it physically. He destroyed Númenor. The only survivor that was on the island was Sauron, and there were several ships of the faithful, led by Elendil, who were already en route to Middle-earth when the calamity happened. Okay, and now we go on to our last question. Our final question comes in from Andrew Thomas, who asks, do you think the Watcher in the water sensed the power on Frodo's person, and that's why it tried to drag him in, or was it simply hungry? I like this question because, in a sense, it's really a matter of opinion. We're not told definitively one way or another. I would say that it was just hungry, or just enraged, really. The Watcher did snag Frodo, and the Fellowship made note of this afterwards. They said, oh, it went right for him. However, Frodo and Boromir were the closest, and Frodo is snack-sized. We don't know what the Watcher really is, other than it's some sort of sea monster that lives in the lake where Eregion used to be. It could have been something like Ungoliant, and sensed that there was something worth eating on Frodo, much as Ungoliant wanted to eat the Silmarils. Or it could have just been a monster that attacked because it was disturbed by Boromir throwing rocks into the lake. To me, that seems the most likely. It was attracted by the rocks, not by the One Ring. It was enraged, and it went for the nearest thing, which happened to be Frodo, because he was sitting by the lake talking to Boromir. Okay, that was all of our questions. I had a great time answering them today. Hope to see you guys next week as well. Send me some questions. Just to give a quick update on things from the channel, we are up to, as of right now, as of me recording it, at least 1,640 subscribers. So that, the growth is really good. I do check the analytics and everything. Everything's up. Watch time is up. Impressions are up. The average time that people watch videos is up, subscribers are up, and that's just absolutely fantastic. If you've made it all the way to the end of the video and you haven't subscribed already, well, here's your opportunity to right a terrible wrong. It's not an opportunity to wrong a terrible right. Maybe we'll do that next week. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, turn on notifications, do all the hoops that they make you jump through these days just to get updates on a channel just the way it is. Consider membership. Membership helps me out. You get to see all the videos early, for example. You get some emotes and such, and it's just a little bit that helps me out, and you will, of course, see all the videos early, and it's not very expensive. We'll see you guys next week.